Hello, Biology 1103 students, and welcome to week 9 of the semester. This week we're going to be talking about what's called biomechanics. And biomechanics talks about how the bones that we use in our body in the appendicular skeleton in order to move around, how they articulate with each other, and how they work together with your muscles in order to allow for the movement of the body. So in the lab this week, you're going to look at these different articulations, so what the different types of joints and the movement allowed by those joints, and also look into different types of levers, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about this week in this lecture. These are the objectives from units 13 and 14. So we'll start out by talking about joints. Joints are wherever two bones come near to one another. Okay, there are a number of different ways that we can classify different joints. We can classify them according to the way, so what forms the joint, but also how much movement is allowed at each joint. Okay, so our joints, the articulation point between two bones. Joints exist between all bones. Even if there is no movement between those two bones, there is a joint there. Okay, so just please remember that. So we can classify the joints by functions, the degree of movement. Some joints don't move, as in the joints between the cranial bones. Some move a bit and some move freely. So we have different names for those. Synarthrotic joints are completely non-movable. Amphiarthrotic joints are slightly immovable, and diarthrotic joints are freely movable. Okay, we can also classify joints by structure. So we can have joints that are held together by dense connective tissue. There are three different kinds like that. There's the suture joint, the syndesmosis, and the gymphosis. You'll notice that suture joints and gymphosis joints are synarthrotic. That means they don't move at all. Syndesmosis joints are amphiarthrotic, which means they move a little bit. We can also have cartilaginous joints. These are also held together by connective tissue, but in this case, it's cartilage. And we have what's called a synchondrosis, which doesn't move, it's synarthrotic, and a symphysis, which is amphiarthrotic, which moves a little bit. And finally, we have synovial joints, and these are the ones that are diarthrotic, the freely moving joints. They're complex joints that are held together by ligaments and joint capsules and this sort of thing. So the point being that whenever we have a joint that does move, there has to be protection between the two bones to stop the bones from grinding against one another. So we'll start out with our fibrous joints. They're held by dense connective tissue. There is no space between the bones, no cavity, and there's little to no movement. So we have the three different types. The suture joint is the one that's found between cranial bones. The jagged ends of the bones interlock like a puzzle. There's dense fibrous connective tissue between the two bones. The syndesmosis are where two bones are held tightly together by dense connective tissue. There is a slight space between, so there is some movement possible, and this is an amphiarthrotic. Okay, so there is a membrane between the radius and the ulna in your lower arm. The membrane keeps them in the correct orientation relative to one another. But of course, the radius and the ulna do move relative to one another. However, the syndesmosis joint there doesn't allow a lot of movement. It does allow a slight amount of movement though. And finally, we have the gymphosis, and the gymphosis is found in the joint between your teeth and with the bone that they socket into. So it's either the mandible, which is the lower jaw, or the maxilla, which is the upper jaw. So those are bones, of course, and then the teeth will slot into that. They're generally immovable, so your teeth don't move within their sockets, and so they're synarthrotic. Again, there's a small amount of ligament that holds the tooth in place. We then have the cartilaginous joints. The bones are held together by cartilage. There is again little or no movement between the bones. The synchondrosis is a synarthrotic. Okay, this is the hyaline cartilage joint. It is found in the epiphyseal plate. Of course, it is only found in the epiphyseal plate until growth ceases, and this becomes the epiphyseal line. So the only place that synchondrosis is found in a mature adult who has ceased growing is at the joint between the rib and the sternum. Okay, it's hyaline cartilage that attaches, that it forms the joint between those two bones, between the ribs and the sternum. And then we have a symphysis, and the symphysis has a fibrocartilage, so that's different, of course, from the hyaline cartilage. It is slightly tougher, has more fibers in it than the hyaline cartilage does. A symphysis joint is slightly movable. It's amphiarthrotic. Two places where we find symphyses are the intervertebral discs, so that's between one vertebrae and its neighboring vertebra, and also at the pubic symphysis, so between the two pubic bones on the anterior side of the body. The pubic symphysis, of course, this is quite a movable joint, especially in women, because the fibrocartilage actually softens at parturition, so at childbirth, to allow for the baby's head to pass more easily through the pelvic cavity. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the synovial joints. And the synovial joints are the diarthrotic joints. These are the ones that are freely movable. They have quite a complex structure, so I'm going to show you a synovial joint, specifically using the knee joint as an example. And then we're going to talk about the different synovial joints that are found in the body and the types of movements that are allowed by each of these synovial joints. Okay, there's a space or cavity between the synovial joints, and this is the joint that joins different bones in most of the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so this is the general structure, and I'm sorry, this is actually the finger, not the knee. The knee is a little bit more complicated because of the presence of the patella, so it makes it a little bit more of a complicated joint. The finger, though, we have two bones that come together. These are two long bones in the case of the finger, okay? The end of one of the long bones, at the ends of each of the long bones at least, have an articular cartilage on them. Okay, this is a remnant of that hyaline cartilage form that was put in place and the bone was built on it. And so the only remnant of that hyaline cartilage form is the articular cartilage at the end of each of the long bones. Okay, the end of the epiphysis of each of the long bones. We also have, so the bones don't actually touch one another. A space is maintained between the two bones, and that space is maintained by membranes. So you can see that there's what's called a synovial membrane. There's also the articular cartilage, which is a capsule, which is a connective tissue which holds the two bones in place near one another. The synovial membrane is a membrane that consists of connective tissue, but also of epithelial tissue, and it does secrete a fluid. It secretes what's called synovial fluid into the joint cavity, the space between the two bones, and this contains a synovial fluid. The synovial fluid further separates the two bones and keeps them from rubbing against one another. So these are the different parts of the synovial joint. The articular capsule, which is fibrous connective tissue, it attaches to the outside membrane around all of the bones. So remember that's called the periosteum, which is this membrane that surrounds all bones. The fibrous connective tissue, the articular capsule, is continuous with the periosteum of the bones. The synovial membrane is just inside that articular capsule. It also lines the ends of each of the long bones. It secretes the synovial fluid. The joint, the synovial cavity, is the space between the two bones, and this contains the synovial fluid. There's also the articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage, which is at the ends of each of the articulating bones and reduces friction and absorbs shock. So this is what it looks like in a knee joint. There are a couple of other structures that are required in the knee joint in order to help it to maintain its structure. The knee actually has a wide variety of movements at the knee joint, but at least he's got a wide variety of potential movements, but there's the attempt to maintain only a certain degree of movement at the knee joint. And so there are other structures that are required in order to restrict movement at the knee joint. And some of those are, first of all, these ligaments here. So there are ligaments within the joint here, and these ligaments are going to restrict the range of movement of that joint. Okay. It also holds the bones in articulation with each other. In addition to that, we do also have what is called a meniscus, and these are other cartilage pads that help to reduce friction as well. And we have bursae. Bursae are fluid-filled pouches that help to reduce the friction on the joint even more. And you can see, of course, because of the presence of the patella, there's a little bit more of a complex joint here. So ligaments are bands of fiber that hold the articulating bones together. Meniscus is a cartilage pad which stops the bones from producing friction on one another. And again, the bursa is a sac of fluid that is strategically located to reduce friction during the joint movement. So these are the possible movements of synovial joints. Not all synovial joints can make all of the following movements because the movements are going to be restricted by the shape of the bones of the joint and also where the muscles are that actually move the bones around that joint. So we have a gliding movement. A gliding movement is where two bones, one of them simply moves side to side or back and forth relative to the other one. We see gliding movement when the ends of the bones, the joint surfaces, are flat or slightly curved. Gliding movement is common in the wrist and in the ankle. We have an angular movement. An angular movement decreases or increases the angle between the articulating bones. For example, we have the humerus in the upper arm and the radius and ulna in the lower arm. And we can see here that as the lower arm moves towards the shoulder, this is flexion, where the angle between the two bones decreases. And then, of course, as the hand moves down, you can see that the angle between the two bones, the upper arm and the lower arm, increases, and that's extension. This is an angular movement. We also have a rotational movement. A rotational movement is where the bone moves around, or at least a body part moves around its own longitudinal axis. Okay, so when we have the atlas articulating with the axis, this results in the rotational movement of the head. And finally, we have circumduction. Now, circumduction is like a combination of all of the different possible angular movements at a joint, okay? So the distal end of the bone moves in a circle. So if we consider the whole of the arm as the bone that is moving, and then the body as the articulating, so in this case, it would be the articulation of the humerus with the scapula. Okay, so what we can see here is that as the arm moves in a circle, so as the hand moves in a circle, the distal end, the hand, moves in a circle. The proximal end, so where the humerus articulates with the scapula, stays relatively constant. Okay, so this is different from rotation. And I'll demonstrate this next week when we talk about the different types of muscles that are required to make different movements. Okay, so we have different types of synovial joints. These different joints are going to have different possible movements allowed. Okay, so we'll talk about the different types of movement that are allowed at each of the synovial joints. So we have planar joints, we have hinge joints, we have pivot joints, condyloid or ellipsoidal joints, saddle joints, and ball and socket joints. So plane joints, also called a planar joint, the articulating surfaces are flat, and this allows, of course, for the gliding movement. Okay, so that's for that side-to-side joints. Wrists and ankles have plane joints in them between the short bones of the wrists and the ankles, the tarsals and the carpals. The hinge joint. The hinge joint is like it sounds. It's like the hinge of a door. It only permits flexion and extension. The knee joint, the elbow joint, and between your phalanges, so between the bones of your fingers, are all hinge joints. Hinge joints can be restricted, as we can see here with the elbow joint. It's actually restricted by the shape of the bones. Okay, so take a look at this when you take a look at the bones of the skeleton. Take a look at how the humerus cups around the ulna in order to create this hinge joint. Okay. And sometimes it's restricted by other structures. So for example, the presence of the patella restricts the knee joint to being a hinge type joint. And again, flexion and extension, those angular movements. The pivot joint, of course, allows for rotational movement. So the atlas and the axis, the dens of the axis in the atlas is a pivot joint. Also, the radius and the ulna. So the ulna, of course, has that rotational ability relative to the radius. The radius also has a little cup that the ulna sits in, and the ulna has a little cup that the radius sits in, and the radius can rotate within that cup of the ulna. This allows for the rotational movement of your hand relative to your arm. So if you hold your arm out straight and rotate your hand only, that movement is the result of the radius and the ulna joint. We also have a condyloid or an ellipsoidal joint. It's where one bone has an oval shape that fits into an oval depression on another bone. This allows for both angular movement, so flexion and extension, and also circumduction, so that movement where the end of the limb moves in a circle, whereas the proximal part of it remains fairly stable, and does not allow for rotation. And this is between the radius and the ulna, again, also between the carpals. Okay, and the carpals, of course, are the bones of the wrist. Just a point about this, because we've talked about two different types of movement that are two different types of joints that are present in the carpals. So in the wrist joints, there are lots of bones in the wrist, as you probably remember from last week, a number of different ones. But we also know that we have amazing flexibility at our wrist. So we have the ability to do angular movement at the wrist. We have ability for circumduction at the wrist. We do also have rotational ability that appears to be at the wrist. Okay, so the hand can move in all of these different directions relative to the rest of the arm. However, it's a number of different joints. So not just the joints between the carpals that are producing the ability to move like this, but also the joint between the radius and the ulna that is also going to be producing this amazing flexibility at the wrist. So we also do have saddle joints. So this is another one. Saddle joints are found at the thumb, between the metacarpal of the thumb and the carpal, and it is a saddle type shape. So both of the bones are saddle shaped and fit together like this, like a rider on a horse, and it allows for angular movement and circumduction. But we cannot rotate our thumb, right? We can move our thumb in an angular way and we can circumduct our thumb, but we can't rotate our thumb. And that's because of the saddle joint there. And then finally, we have the ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint is the most versatile of all of the joints. It is exactly what it sounds like, is that the end of one bone appears to be a ball that fits into a depression or a ball-shaped depression on the other one. So examples, of course, are at the humerus and the scapula. Produces have a ball and socket joint. Also, the femur and the ischium have a ball and socket joint as well. This allows for all movements, including rotational movement. Okay, so we can have the angular movements and circumduction and rotational movements at ball and socket joints. Okay. So now we're going to move into what's called biomechanics, and we're going to talk about how the muscles work with our bones in order to produce different types of movement. So we're going to talk about how muscles attach to bone and look at the principles of muscular antagonism. We briefly touched on muscular antagonism already, so we're coming back to it here. Okay, so muscles are held to bones through tendons. Tendons are dense fibrous connective tissue. Again, this is continuous with the periosteum around a bone, okay, and also continuous with the connective tissue layer that surrounds and is within muscles that we're going to talk about next week, okay? They transfer the force produced by the muscle's contraction and cause the joint to move, okay? So remember that tendons connect muscles to bone. Ligaments are dense connective tissue that attach bone to bone. So the two ends of a muscle are attached to different bones. So muscles always span at least one joint. Sometimes they will span more than one joint. And this is, of course, the skeletal muscle that causes the movement, overall movement of the body. So when a muscle contracts, usually one bone remains stationary and the other bone will move. So where the bone that remains stationary when a muscle contracts is considered to be the origin of the muscle, and the bone that moves when a muscle contracts is considered to be the insertion of the muscle. We're going to come back and you'll talk about that more in lab next week when you talk about the muscles, which end is the origin and insertion. So your biceps brachii muscle, you guys know this one. You say flex your biceps, you know which one that is. It's attached to which bones? It's first of all attached to your scapula, which is your shoulder bone, okay? And also to the radius. So you'll notice that this muscle actually spans two different, it spans two joints. It spans your shoulder joint and your elbow joint. However, contraction of your biceps brachii muscle causes your lower arm to move relative to your upper arm. Okay, so it is attached to the scapula, but it's attached to the scapula right basically at the joint with the humerus, but it's going to move your lower arm relative to the humerus. So when your biceps brachii muscle contracts, the scapula doesn't move. Okay, the scapula stays relatively stationary and the radius is going to move. The radius moves towards the humerus. Okay, it results in the flexion of your lower arm relative to your upper arm. Okay, so the origin of the biceps brachii muscle is a scapula and the insertion of the biceps brachii muscle is the radius. But muscles don't work by themselves. Muscles work in pairs to affect opposite movements. We've seen this already. We saw it when we talked a little bit about peristalsis, is that the circular and the longitudinal muscles around your esophagus, for example, contract and relax antagonistically in order to move food through the digestive system. We also saw it in the eye, where we looked at the muscles, muscles of the iris, and we also had radial and circular muscles of the iris, and they worked antagonistically as well. Okay, in order to either close or open your pupil. Okay, so whenever we talk about muscular antagonism, one of them causes a particular action, and the one that has to be relaxed is the antagonist. So for example, we have, of course, in order to flex and extend our lower arm, we have the biceps brachii muscle and the triceps brachii muscle. Okay, the biceps brachii muscle is contracted during your lower arm flexion. At the same time, your triceps brachii muscle has to be relaxed. When you are flexing your lower arm, the biceps brachii is the agonist and the triceps brachii is the antagonist. When you are extending your lower arm, as shown on the right-hand side here, the opposite is true. In order to extend your lower arm, the triceps brachii muscle has to be contracted, making it the agonist, and the biceps brachii muscle has to be relaxed, which makes it the antagonist. Okay, so we can look at this antagonism in a number of different situations. But just remember, whichever one is contracted to make the action occur is the agonist, and the other one that has to be relaxed is called the antagonist. Okay, so now we're going to move into a little bit of physics, which talks about how the different bones and muscles in our body are actually lever systems. And lever systems allow us to kind of quantify how much energy is required in order to cause a specific movement in our body. Okay, so when we talk about all of the movements around different joints in our bodies, we can consider them as levers. You may have used a lever before in order to help you do some sort of work. So for example, if you used a crowbar in order to lift something very large, you're using a lever system. If you've used a wheelbarrow, you're using a lever system. And so we are just going to spend a bit of time talking about what lever systems are. Okay, so a lever system consists of a number of different parts. There is the lever, of course. This is the rigid rod that moves on a fixed point. In the case of the movement of our skeleton, the lever is a bone. Okay, so that's what we're considering to be the lever in this case. The fulcrum is where that lever moves. Our bones, of course, only move at the joint at one end or the other. Okay, so the fulcrum in this case is always going to be a joint. There are two different forces that act upon the lever. There's, first of all, the effort is the force that tries to make the bone move. So this would be contraction of the muscle. The contraction of the muscle is the effort. And then there's the load. The load resists the movement. And so the load is whatever is at the other end of that lever. In the case of most of the time, it's our body part. So we're just trying to move our body weight. And so the load is whatever body weight is. However, if you're picking something up with your hands, of course, then the load is increased by whatever the mass is of whatever it is that you're trying to move as well. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We have our lever, of course, which is the bone. We have a fulcrum. This shows the fulcrum in the middle, the joint in the middle. We're going to see that most of the time, that's not the case. Okay, the fulcrum is going to be at one or other end of the lever. The force is the force required to move the load, and the load or resistance is at the other end. This is a classic, what's called first-class lever, and I'll talk about the different classes of levers in a minute. But this is a classic first-class lever. The first-class lever has the fulcrum in the middle, the effort at one end, and the load at the other end. This is if you've ever played on a teeter-totter. This is a first-class lever. Okay? The first-class lever is shown here. There is only one example of a first-class lever in the body, and that is, of course, where the vertebrae articulate with the skull. Okay, and you can see here that you kind of have to imagine where the actual lever bar is in this case, because there's no bone across there, but the lever bar is kind of an imaginary line that runs from your chin to the back of your head. When you tilt your head up, okay, so you tilt your chin up, your head back, what happens, of course, is that your face is the load. The fulcrum is the point where your atlas articulates with your skull, and the effort, of course, are your neck muscles. Okay, the trapezius muscle, for example, that would contract and pull your head back like that. Okay, that's an example of a first-class lever. A second-class lever has the fulcrum at one end. And you can see here the fulcrum is at one end. The resistance is in the middle. So what you're trying to lift is in the middle. And then the effort is at the other end. Okay? So the interesting thing about this is if you've ever used a wheelbarrow, you've used a second-class lever. Okay, so the fulcrum is kind of like the wheel at the front. You put the stuff that you want to move in the back and the bucket of the wheelbarrow, and then you lift up at the other end. And you will know that you can actually lift a huge amount more using a wheelbarrow than you would be able to if you just tried to lift it with your hands. Okay, you can load up that wheelbarrow with all sorts of stuff and lift it and move it when you couldn't have lifted that much stuff by yourself. As we're going to see, second-class levers are what are called power levers. There's only one location in the body where there is a second-class lever. So when you raise yourself up on your toes, okay, the fulcrum is, of course, the joint between your metatarsals and your phalanges. Okay, the load is your body weight centered on the middle or the arch of your foot. And then the effort is the contraction of the muscle at the back of your leg called the gastrocnemius muscle. It's a power lever. As we're going to see, it can move a much larger weight using less power or less input than other levers. And finally, we have the third-class lever. The third-class lever is the most common type of lever in the body. This makes sense because of the way that our bodies are structured. It would be very, very difficult to have a whole lot of second-class levers or even first-class levers in our bodies. Okay? In the case of a third-class lever, the fulcrum is at one end of the lever bar. The resistance is at the other end of the lever bar, and the effort is somewhere in the middle. Okay, this is a very inefficient lever in terms of transformation of energy. However, this lever can move more quickly than a second-class lever. So it's called a speed lever. So it can move a lot more quickly, but it does take more energy. You have to put more energy in to move the same mass of substance as you would if you were just not using a lever at all. Okay, so flexing your biceps is an example of the third-class lever. Most of the levers in our bodies, in our body at least, are third-class levers. Okay, so what's the difference? Different locations of the fulcrum load and resistance will result in differences in what's called mechanical advantage. It is the measure of the force amplification achieved by using a lever. Power levers have the ability to at least allow you to lift a much heavier object than you would be able to without the lever. Speed levers are better at providing you with speed. So as we saw, second-class levers are power levers and third-class levers are speed levers. Okay. Power levers require a small effort to move a very large load. Speed levers require a large effort to move a smaller load. So this is an example of mechanical advantage. So as you can see from your lab manual, you can calculate mechanical advantage by looking at the ratio between the length of the effort arm to the length of the load arm. Okay, so the load arm is the distance between the fulcrum and the load, and the effort arm is the distance between the fulcrum and the effort. Okay, so I'll just give you an example here. So if we look at the difference between a second-class lever and a third-class lever, okay, so if you look at the third-class lever, we're looking at, of course, we'll go back here, mechanical advantage is effort arm divided by load arm. Okay, so if we look at our second-class lever here, okay, effort arm divided by load arm. Okay, in this case, we're calling it a resistance instead of a load. That's okay, either one works. Okay, so we have, of course, the distance between this is our effort arm, okay, and this is the load arm. Okay, so we're going to make this easy. This is going to be 10 centimeters, and this is going to be 5 centimeters. Okay, so we have the effort arm divided by the load arm. Mechanical advantage equals 10 centimeters divided by 5 centimeters. Mechanical advantage in this case is 2. Okay. In this case, again, we're going to look at the effort arm divided by the load arm. Okay, so what we'll do here is we'll use the same values. So the effort arm in this case is 5 centimeters, and the load arm in this case is 10 centimeters. Again, effort arm divided by load arm. Mechanical advantage equals 5 centimeters over 10 centimeters equals 0.5. So we can see here that our second class lever, we have a mechanical advantage of 2, okay? Mechanical advantage greater than 1 means you apply less force to a lever than the weight of the load that you're trying to move. In the third class lever, we have a mechanical advantage of 0.5. The mechanical advantage of less than 1 means you actually have to apply a greater force to the lever than the weight of the load that you're trying to move. Okay, so we can see here that the third class lever has a mechanical advantage of less than 1. The second class has greater than 1. I didn't use the first class lever because depending on where that fulcrum lands between the two, a first class lever could have a mechanical advantage of greater than 1, or it could have a mechanical advantage of less than 1. So it gets a bit confusing. Okay, so now what we can do is we can calculate how much effort is required to move a load of a specific value using a specific lever. Okay, so we know that the load multiplied by the distance of the load arm is going to be equal to the effort, the weight of the effort, multiplied by the length of the effort arm. We want to know what is the effort. We just do a little bit of magical movement of our variables around in order to solve for the effort, and the effort ends up being the weight of the load multiplied by the load arm divided by the effort arm. Okay, so again, mechanical advantage is effort over load. We can see this, that in order to calculate this, we need the load divided by the effort. So it's kind of like the inverse of the mechanical advantage. So we have effort equals the weight of the load multiplied by the inverse of the mechanical advantage. Okay? So here is an example calculation. Okay? And this uses, of course, this is a third class lever from our body. This is the third class lever that is the lower arm. And you can see here the fulcrum is all the way at the one end. The fulcrum is our joint between our humerus and the lower arm, between the humerus and the ulna. We also have our effort. Our effort is the biceps brachii muscle, and you can see that the insertion of the biceps brachii muscle is quite close to that joint. And the resistance, or the load, is going to be your hand. Okay, so we'll first of all determine the distances here. And we're going to again use kind of as simple as we can. We're going to say that the distance between the fulcrum and our load is going to be 20 centimeters. Okay, and then the distance between our fulcrum and our insertion of the biceps brachii muscle is going to be, 2 centimeters. That says 2 there. Okay. So we can calculate then what is the load arm divided by the effort arm, first of all. Okay, so the load arm divided by the effort arm is going to be 20 centimeters divided by 2 centimeters. Okay, so our effort is going to be whatever our load is. We'll determine what the load is in just a minute. Multiplied by 20 centimeters divided by 2 centimeters. Okay, all right. Now our load, for example, we could just use the weight of the arm, but let's say that we're trying to actually move a 10 kilogram weight. Okay, so now we're just going to calculate this. So 10 kilograms multiplied by 10 divided by 2, okay, which ends up being a value of 10. So 10 times 10, we can see that we need to input 100 kilograms of effort into our lever here in order to move our 10 kilogram weight. Okay? We can also, though, use the same principles to calculate the distance the load will move under a specific force. Okay, so we can still use the load arm divided by the effort arm, so we can keep this value here. But say that our biceps brachii muscle, let's just go back. Our biceps brachii muscle is going to contract, contract by 2 centimeters. If our biceps brachii muscle contracts by 2 centimeters, that's the distance moved by the effort. Let's see if I can do this down here without causing anything crazy. Multiplied again by our load arm divided by effort arm, which is 2 centimeters over 20 centimeters over 2 centimeters. I'll just input the value of 10 there. Okay, we can see that when our biceps brachii muscle contracts by 2 centimeters, our hand can move by 20 centimeters. Okay, so you can see that even though it takes a lot of energy in order to move an object using our third class lever here, we can actually move our load a great distance, which is the advantage, of course, to our third class levers. If you want to, you can kind of fiddle around with the calculations and see what sort of calculations you'd get, same sort of idea, with a second class lever. You can also it's a kind of a fun imagining, but you imagine what would happen if instead of being inserted here, if our biceps brachii muscle is actually inserted down here. Okay, of course that would make a very funny looking arm, first of all, but also it would have a big influence. It would, of course, mean that you wouldn't have to input as much energy. It would be a more powerful lever, certainly, but you wouldn't be able to move your arm as great a distance. Okay, so if you want to, you can fiddle around with that yourself. There is the opportunity to do some calculations in lab this week as well. Alrighty then. So next week, you'll be looking at the muscle lab 1. You'll be looking at the muscles of the upper torso. And of course, then you'll be carrying out movements and trying to determine which muscles are involved in that. It's kind of a fun lab. So I hope that you all have a good week, and I will see you all on Thursday.